He spent a lifetime painting the America we wanted to believe in: front porches in summer, Sunday bests, the warm laughter of families gathered round a table. But in 1964, Norman Rockwell picked up his brush and did something he'd never dared to do in public. He painted the truth, not the postcard, not the myth, the truth that stalked the sidewalks and bled through the headlines, ugly, ordinary, and undeniable. The image is simple, almost quiet. A small black girl in a white dress walks forward, 4 federal marshals flanking her. We never see their faces. We only see hers, steady, composed, and the wall beside her. A slur scrawled in fat letters. A tomato exploded into red. That's it. No speech, no sermon. A child walking to school in a country still deciding whether she should be allowed inside. Galleries refused to hang it. Newspapers looked away. Subscriptions were canceled. Threats arrived. Because if Norman Rockwell, the soft-spoken, meticulous draftsman who had framed the national dream for nearly half a century, was now insisting that this was also America, then what else had we decided not to see? This is the story of an artist who escaped into ideal scenes because the real ones hurt too much, and who, at the end, chose injury over illusion. It's the story of a studio that burned, a marriage that broke, and a conscience that would not. Of a man accused of selling sentiment, who finally risked the one thing sentiment could never buy: his legacy. The painting was called "The Problem We All Live With." The problem wasn't the child. It was us.
Before he was the man who painted America's smile, Norman Rockwell was a boy who couldn't quite find his own. He was born in Harlem, New York City, in 1894, thin, awkward, and too serious for his age. His father, a devout Presbyterian, worked long hours for a textile company. His mother, an Episcopalian, was frail and often sick. Their home was quiet, filled with books and unspoken worries. Norman's world was small, but inside it, stories were everything. Each night, his father read Charles Dickens aloud, his voice painting the room with words of hardship, hope, and redemption. Norman listened, mesmerized. He learned that a simple face could carry an entire story, that small details, a hand, a gesture, a glance, could reveal the whole truth of a person. While other children played, Norman watched and drew. His family moved from the city to the calmer streets of Mamaroneck when he was 9. There, surrounded by wide skies and unhurried lives, Rockwell discovered the setting that would haunt him forever: small-town America. He studied its rhythms: the paperboy's whistle, the clatter of kitchen pans, the way sunlight fell across a white porch. He saw beauty not in glamour, but in decency. And he believed that if he could paint that decency well enough, people might become a little better just by looking at it. By 14, Rockwell left high school and enrolled in art school full-time. His parents worried, but Norman had already found his purpose. He trained obsessively, learning anatomy, composition, and light, not to chase fame, but to tell stories the way Dickens had told them, with truth wrapped in tenderness. In 1912, at just 18, he sold his first illustrations for a series of children's books. The check, $150, might as well have been a fortune. For the first time, he felt that maybe the world had a place for someone like him. But even in these early victories, the seeds of something darker were growing. Rockwell was driven by a fear that never left him, the fear of being ordinary, of never belonging. He would spend the rest of his life painting the belonging he couldn't feel.
By the time Norman Rockwell turned 22, he had already painted the version of America everyone wanted to believe in. In 1916, the Saturday Evening Post published his first cover, a wholesome boy holding a baby, his face a mix of pride and panic. That single image changed everything. The Post was America's living room. Landing on its cover meant immortality. Within a year, Rockwell's name was as familiar as the faces he painted. For the next 4 decades, his brush became the heartbeat of the nation. He painted the virtues people wanted to see in themselves: courage, innocence, patriotism, good manners. His characters were the people you wished lived next door: the kindly cop, the mischievous boy, the hard-working mother. His art made ordinary life look divine, and divine life look ordinary. But even as success surrounded him, Rockwell felt something hollow echoing underneath. Behind every cheerful grin he painted, there was a whisper in his mind. It isn't that simple. At the Saturday Evening Post, there were strict, unspoken rules: no politics, no sadness, and certainly no black faces, unless they stood in the background holding a tray or shining shoes. The America on Rockwell's canvas had only one color, one class, one mood: perfection. He obeyed those rules for decades, telling himself that maybe he was painting the world as it should be, but deep down he knew he was helping to maintain a lie. He painted what people wanted to see, not what they needed to see. When the Great Depression hit, his idyllic scenes became a form of escape. During World War II, his Four Freedoms paintings, inspired by Roosevelt's speech, lifted the nation's morale, raising millions for war bonds. To the public, he was a hero. To himself, he was a prisoner of his own reputation. As his fame grew, so did his silence. He buried himself in work, painting families while his own life fractured behind closed doors. His first marriage crumbled. He suffered breakdowns that he hid behind deadlines. And yet, every time the world needed hope, Norman Rockwell delivered another perfect smile. But perfection is a heavy mask to wear. And sooner or later, even the most loyal storyteller grows tired of pretending his stories are true. By the 1940s, Norman Rockwell wasn't just a painter. He was America. His covers for the Saturday Evening Post arrived like clockwork, each one a polished window into a world where everything felt right. Soldiers came home to welcoming arms, families gathered around golden turkeys, children played in streets untouched by fear. His brush transformed everyday life into a national myth, a shared dream that crossed state lines and social divides. In 1943, he painted the Four Freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, inspired by President Franklin D. Roosevelt's address to Congress. He used his neighbors as models, ordinary people cast as symbols of America's highest ideals. The paintings toured the country, raising more than $130 million in war bonds, the equivalent of over $2 billion today. Millions of Americans saw those images and believed they were looking at themselves. And maybe, for a moment, they were. But behind the brushstrokes of hope, Rockwell's private world was burning. Just months after the Four Freedoms tour, his studio went up in flames. Hundreds of original paintings, years of work, turned to ash in one night. Rockwell stood among the ruins, silent, clutching the charred remains of his favorite pipe. Neighbors brought him new ones, a small act of kindness in the face of devastation. He thanked them, but inside, something had shifted. He had spent his life building a perfect America,
and now his own world had crumbled in smoke. At home, his second wife, Mary, battled alcoholism and depression. She was in and out of psychiatric hospitals, undergoing electroshock therapy. Their house in Vermont was quiet, haunted by the sound of rain on windows and the hum of isolation. Rockwell painted joy by day and visited his wife's treatment center by night. He once wrote, "I paint life as I wish it were." But the wish was getting harder to believe. By the 1950s, the world he had painted was changing. Civil rights protests filled the headlines. Television replaced magazines. The innocence that defined his art was fading. Yet the Saturday Evening Post demanded the same stories: cheerful, white, untouched by conflict. He delivered, even as his heart turned elsewhere. He began to feel trapped by his own success, a man imprisoned by nostalgia. He envied younger artists who were painting truth, the turbulence of war, the rawness of protest, the darkness he himself had long suppressed. When his wife Mary died suddenly in 1959, Rockwell was 65. Her death hollowed him. The man who had painted thousands of smiling faces could no longer find one inside himself. His doctor and therapist, Eric Erickson, urged him to look deeper, to confront the void he'd spent decades covering in color. It was in those therapy sessions that Rockwell finally began to understand what his art had been all along: a desperate search for belonging. His happy families, his loyal dogs, his shining towns, they were self-portraits of the life he never truly had. He realized that for years he had painted a safe America because he was afraid to face the real one. And so in 1963, at the age of 69, Norman Rockwell made the most radical decision of his career. He walked away from the Saturday Evening Post. 47 years, 321 covers, and he left it all behind. He joined Look magazine, a publication known for confronting race, poverty, and social issues. For the first time, Rockwell was free. Free from commercial expectations, free from fantasy, free to paint what kept him awake at night. But freedom has a price. The same audience that once adored him would soon turn against him. His next painting wouldn't sell war bonds or Thanksgiving nostalgia. It would divide a nation. And it would show a truth so painful, so raw, that America would spend decades pretending it never existed.
In 1964, Norman Rockwell stood before a blank canvas and did what he'd avoided for nearly 50 years. He painted reality. Gone were the cheerful faces, the soft sunlight, the warm tones of an imagined America. In their place stood a 6-year-old black girl in a white dress, walking past a wall smeared with hate. Her name was Ruby Bridges, and she was the first black child to integrate an all-white school in New Orleans. The painting was called "The Problem We All Live With." Rockwell's brush trembled as he worked. He chose every detail with purpose. The marshal's arms, strong, faceless, protecting her. The smashed tomato, bright red against the concrete, a symbol of both violence and shame. The racial slur scrawled across the wall, offensive, undeniable, deliberately left half visible. He wanted no excuses, no distance, no denial. When Look magazine published the painting in January 1964, the nation erupted. Thousands of readers canceled their subscriptions. Rockwell's mailbox filled with hate mail. Some called him a race traitor. Others warned him to stick to painting smiles. The man who had once embodied the moral center of America was now accused of betraying it. But Norman Rockwell didn't care. He told Look's editor, "If I don't paint it, who will?" This was no longer the sentimental illustrator of the Saturday Evening Post. This was a man exorcising guilt, the guilt of decades spent painting a world without pain, without diversity, without truth. For nearly half a century, he had hidden behind his own perfectionism. Now, at 70 years old, he was finally ready to confront what America had become and what he had ignored. That courage came with a cost. He received death threats. Newspapers refused to reprint the image. Art galleries shunned it. Even his longtime fans turned their backs on him, calling him too political, too angry, too old to understand. But Rockwell had seen the truth too clearly to return to the dream. That same year, 3 young civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered in Mississippi by the Ku Klux Klan. When Rockwell heard the news, he couldn't sleep. He saw the faces of the dead in his mind, lit only by torchlight. He painted what he saw. The result was murder in Mississippi. It was dark, violent, and raw, unlike anything he had ever done. He spent 5 weeks on it, painting through nights, breaking into tears as he worked. The finished piece showed 3 men moments before death, surrounded by unseen shadows. There was no hope in it, no redemption, just the unbearable weight of truth. Critics were divided. Some called it a masterpiece. Others called it propaganda. But Rockwell no longer cared about praise or condemnation. For once, he wasn't painting for America. He was painting to it. By 1967, he had completed another daring piece, New Kids in the Neighborhood. It depicted black and white children meeting for the first time after school desegregation. No drama, no speeches, just quiet, uneasy curiosity. 2 moving trucks, 2 sets of children, 1 fragile beginning. In that stillness, Rockwell painted what America might yet become. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man once criticized for being too innocent was now condemned for being too honest. But for Rockwell, this was his redemption. He had spent his life painting what he wished were true. Now he painted what was true, no matter how much it hurt. He told friends, "I used to paint the best of America. Now I paint the rest of America." And perhaps in that reversal, he finally became the artist he was meant to be. The public eventually moved on, but Rockwell never did. Each new painting cost him a little more of himself. He had turned his art into a mirror, and once you've seen what's in the mirror, you can't unsee it. His hands aged, his brush shook, yet the images stayed sharp. The laughter was gone, replaced by silence, by reckoning. Norman Rockwell was no longer painting America's dream. He was painting its conscience.
By the time Norman Rockwell finished The Problem We All Live With and Murder in Mississippi, he was no longer the nation's painter, he was its conscience. But being a conscience comes with a price. The hate mail never stopped. Strangers wrote that he had betrayed his own people. Galleries that once competed to showcase his work quietly declined his calls. Friends from the Saturday Evening Post, the same editors who had built their empire on his art, stopped inviting him to dinner parties. To them, he was no longer America's sweetheart. He was the man who dirtied the tablecloth. Rockwell, now in his 70s, began to isolate himself in his Stockbridge, Massachusetts studio.
The walls that once rang with the sounds of laughter and brushes scraping against wood now held only silence. His third wife, Molly, kept him grounded, managing his appointments and shielding him from the worst letters, but even she couldn't stop the insomnia. He woke most nights in cold sweats, haunted by faces, rubies, the murdered boys in Mississippi, the ghosts of the America he'd once painted so gently. He wrote in his diary, "I spent a lifetime painting happiness because I wanted to feel it. Now I paint sadness because I finally can." The nation moved on to pop art and abstraction. Andy Warhol painted soup cans. The magazines that once worshipped Rockwell declared his realism out of date. He was the relic of a past everyone wanted to forget. Yet, paradoxically, his most painful work was now his most enduring. Privately, Rockwell's health declined. Years of anxiety, perfectionism, and depression took their toll. Therapy bills piled up. More than $50,000 by the time he died, nearly $200,000 in today's money. He never complained. Maybe, deep down, he saw it as penance. When he finally passed in 1978, at the age of 84, the obituary headlines celebrated the smiling America of the Saturday Evening Post. Few mentioned the problem we all live with. Few dared to speak about the artist who had turned his own paradise into a battlefield for truth. But even in death, Rockwell had one last twist waiting. Years later, hidden behind a fake wall in another artist's house, one of his long-lost paintings, Breaking Home Ties, was discovered. It showed a young boy leaving his father for college. Hope, fear, and love captured in a single frozen moment. The hidden masterpiece sold for millions. It was fitting. Even in secret, Norman Rockwell's truth had survived, buried perhaps, but never erased. He had painted the dream, destroyed it, and finally painted the reckoning.
Decades after his death, the America Norman Rockwell painted has changed, but not entirely. His cheerful Saturday mornings and front porch smiles now belong to nostalgia. Yet his darker, braver paintings, the ones that nearly ruined him, have outlived every cover, every Thanksgiving dinner, every child with a freckled grin. In 2011, inside the White House, a quiet moment unfolded. President Barack Obama stood before the problem we all live with. Beside him was Ruby Bridges, now a grown woman. The same child once escorted by U.S. Marshals, the same girl Rockwell immortalized in defiance and innocence. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Obama said softly, "If it wasn't for you, I might not be here today." 50 years earlier, that painting had been too offensive to hang in public. Now it stood inside the home of the nation's first black president. The image that once divided America had become one of its proudest symbols of progress. Time had finally caught up to Rockwell's truth. Historians began to re-examine his legacy, realizing he was not the naive sentimentalist critics had dismissed, but a man who used idealism as armor until he found the courage to remove it. His late works, The Problem We All Live With, Murder in Mississippi, New Kids in the Neighborhood, became case studies in artistic rebellion. How a man built a career on fantasy, then spent his final years painting his way out of it. Rockwell's story is no longer about the perfect America he once sold to the world. It's about the real America he finally revealed, the one still learning, still struggling, still unfinished. In the end, Norman Rockwell didn't just paint America's reflection. He forced it to look in the mirror. And maybe that's what makes him, at last, not just a painter of dreams,
but a painter of truth.
Behind every perfect image lies a truth someone tried to hide. For decades, Norman Rockwell was the man who painted America's dream. But when that dream began to rot from the inside, he was the only one brave enough to paint the rot itself. He lost fans, he lost friends, but he found his soul. Art is supposed to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable, and Rockwell did both. His paintings asked a question that still matters today. What kind of world are we willing to see? Because denial is easy, truth is expensive. And sometimes the only thing more dangerous than a lie is the man who dares to expose it. This was the story of the painting America tried to bury and the artist who refused to let it die. Subscribe and stay with us beyond the red carpet, where truth still has a face.